All right, so I have another one of the hard to pronounce names. Oh, I guess I'm going to do one. My name's Madhurima. I go by Rima, it's a little bit easier to pronounce. And on behalf of a pretty large group of collaborators, I'll be presenting on our project to audit design justice, the impact of social movements on design pedagogy at a technical institution. And the institution in question for this kind of case study is MIT, and I'll say kind of off the bat, it'll come up in future work, but if any of this sounds interesting to you, and you feel like this is kind of a methodology you're interested in implementing in your own institutions, that's something we'd really like to explore further to kind of see how things might be similar or different. And so keep that in mind as you listen to what we're talking about. So a little bit of the background of why we're interested in this. The social movements of 2020 related to the pandemic, kind of growing concerns related to climate change, racial justice, the Me Too movement, things like that. A lot of these kind of gained momentum in the last couple of years, and we were particularly interested in seeing if that kind of changed any discourse in the educational spaces, especially as students were kind of getting involved in a lot of these movements and starting thinking about them more. I mentioned the term design justice in the title, and so in order to kind of explain why that's the framework we're using, I'll talk through a couple of the other ones that we've heard mentioned earlier today. So user-centered design is really about kind of treating users as informants, and it's kind of a narrow focus on people's role as users, particular type of engagement with the community. And human-centered design kind of treats users more as main contributors and has an additional concern for people. And things like co-design sort of fall in this umbrella a little bit. And then we're thinking about design justice, which is really focused on an equitable distribution of design's benefits and burdens. This is a definition from Sasha Costanza-Chalk's book, Design Justice. It goes on to talk about how it includes a fair and meaningful participation in design decisions and recognition of community-based design traditions, knowledge, and practices as part of this framework. So this framework comes with a series of different questions to help guide the process of thinking through creating new designs. So the first question is related to equity, so about who gets to do design. Beneficiaries, which is all about who do we design for or with. Values, which is what values do we encode and reproduce in the objects and systems that we design. Scope, which is how do we scope and frame our design problems. Sites, which is about where we do design, which sites are getting privilege, which ones are being ignored. Ownership, accountability, and political economy is thinking about who owns and profits from the design outcomes, which social relationships are produced by design, and kind of how to move more towards community control of these processes. Discourse, which is focused on what stories we tell about how things are designed. And then histories, which is a new one that we kind of added to this framework, which is thinking about kind of a follow-on for discourse, but acknowledging unequal histories and historical harms that arise from the way that we use technology or do designs. So again, these are the kind of main questions, and this will come up in our analysis, so I wanted to make sure to go through them. So the methodology for our project, we logged all the classes in 6 kind of key departments in our institution and wrote some corresponding memos. Then we analyzed the syllabi from these classes, identified the design frameworks being used for each course, and then did a kind of analysis of the meaningful and supervisual inclusion of the design justice content. And overall, we analyzed 240 syllabi, which, as far as we're aware, is the largest audit of its kind, so we're very excited about that. So as I mentioned, we looked at 6 key departments. These were mechanical engineering, nuclear science and engineering, urban studies and planning, architecture, electrical engineering and computer science, and media arts and sciences. And the way that we chose these is kind of a combination of areas where our research team had expertise, but we also wanted to make sure that there was a variety of types of design encompassed, both for hardware and software, large-scale social technical systems, products, different definitions of design in each of these disciplines, so really thinking about design very broadly. And so the next step was to identify the courses of interest. So first we collected the names and descriptions of the courses offered in these 6 departments in fall 2019 and fall 2020. Then we identified courses that potentially contained design or critique paradigms, and also courses that contained ethics, equity, or justice themes. And what's kind of key here is that sometimes, instead of eliminating classes that, as soon as they didn't include anything design or critique, we wanted to make sure that if they had some of these themes present, we were still keeping them, because it's also interesting to see if these topics are showing up but not in the same space as the design is showing up. So then we developed a syllabus analysis rubric with kind of 4 components. So the first was the introduction, which collects the background information, and then features of the syllabus that might relate to justice, ethics, and equity. So this includes things like a land acknowledgement, or policies related to mental health, things like that, being very upfront to see if that's kind of could be a tell for a socially minded instructor. The next is the course description. So these are the things that show up in like the course catalog. And so we analyzed these for 26 terms related to design justice. So this was done with a script using things kind of a more broad definition. So of course we have things like ethics, equity, justice, but you also have things such as anti-racism and feminism and sustainability that were terms in this portion. Next is the actual syllabus itself. So here we looked at the presence of those design justice questions that I went through at the beginning, and then also looking at which design paradigms were used in the course. And finally, a summary, which is going over the core learning methods used in the course, and then whether it's a design class or a design critique class, and if it's covering design justice topics explicitly or implicitly, and then meaningfully or superficially. So for the purpose of this analysis, we're really focusing on the second half, more of the actual syllabus itself. So after iteration through the draft analysis rubric and coming to a consensus on a final version, we analyzed all the syllabi collected from the departments and had 2 coders per syllabus and went through a whole inter-rater process for that, of course. And so here, this is where we have kind of a big picture view of all of the courses and the fraction of courses that included each specific design justice related question. So you can see that beneficiaries and histories are the ones that kind of came up the most often. Surprisingly, equity, which is related to who gets to do design, was the one that kind of showed up the least. And so we'll go into a little bit more of a granular view of how this looks department by department. So overall, you can see that urban studies and planning by far engage with design justice the most. There are the orange bars here. You can see kind of across the board, every single design justice question, they were kind of looking at that strongly. But then there's some other things that are interesting too. So you see nuclear engineering. There's a much bigger focus on histories. There we go. History, so this is the purple. That's a department where there is some discussion around things that have gone wrong in the past, nuclear disasters that have happened. How do you avoid those things in the future? So that's a bigger part of the discourse than it is in maybe some other engineering disciplines. You'll see that architecture, media arts, and sciences, those also have a kind of higher presence. Red is electrical engineering and computer science, very, very low presence across the board. This again was a little bit surprising as discussion around these topics in software is kind of gaining a lot of prominence right now with a lot of recognition around things like facial recognition and those kinds of topics and what is the responsibility for someone in the data sets you're using and things like that. So kind of as I pointed out earlier, you can see that the non-engineering courses engage with design justice much more. And of course, a big part of this is the huge engagement of urban studies and planning with these topics. But it is a bit troubling to see this kind of breakdown. So overall, we saw that most courses did not explicitly engage with design justice. There was little to no mention of this range of topics in most of the classes, and also the focuses were typically implicit rather than explicit, except for in urban studies and planning. But we do have some exemplars that I wanted to kind of call out as courses that did a really excellent job of this. So one category is where design justice and related concepts are main learning objectives of the course. So these are classes that are focusing on things like anti-racist design or something like that, where a lot of the course readings are related to topics related to design justice, in addition to having a lot of design content as well. One is where design justice concepts are incorporated into technical pedagogy. So we saw an example of this in a course that was restructured when a new instructor took over. It was a class that was about mapping, and so it covered the technical aspects of mapping, how to do things with GIS and all of that, but it also covered the kind of historical significance of mapping and how it's been used in cases such as redlining, or been used to kind of allow for discriminatory practices, and bringing that into the technical content of the course. And then the third is emphasis on direct engagement with the community. So we saw some examples in disciplines such as mechanical engineering, where they had people go on field trips to go and kind of directly engage with user groups and speak with the community, get folks involved almost as co-designers, things like that, with a high emphasis on not just coming in and giving somebody a design and saying, hey, I made this for you. So on the flip side, opportunities for growth. The first is over-intellectualizing ethics, equity, and justice. So there are some cases where courses covered the material, but in a very kind of high-level way, only focusing on the theory, not giving students the tools and techniques for how to implement this in their design practice, but really just talking about it as like high-level concepts. One is the opposite of what I was just speaking about, so developing products or systems for underserved communities without directly engaging with those communities. So just coming in and saying, here's the problem that I think you have, and here's something I created to solve it. And the third is treating ethics, equity, and justice in cursory and inconsistent ways across the course offerings. So having it be high priority in some spaces, not mentioned at all in others, and kind of having inconsistency of how the sort of discipline treats it as important or not. And there's more kind of details about all of these exemplars as well in the paper, so I encourage you to check that out. Overall, the huge takeaway is that engineering courses haven't been prioritizing these topics as far as we're able to see in the syllabus. There were minimal changes between fall 2019 and fall 2020. We think in part that is due to the fact that many classes don't change their syllabi regularly, so it's possible that even if content changed, we didn't see that reflected. And we also want to acknowledge that that's when a lot of instructors were moving their classes to being remote. And so that could have been the priority versus trying to integrate these topics that were also coming up. And then there's a variation in the type of design justice questions being explored across the departments based on what those departments' focus areas are, such as the nuclear example that I mentioned. And then I think really important kind of a discussion point is how to engage with design justice in technical courses in a way that isn't harmful, so in a way that's meaningful, not done superficially as an add-on, and thinking about it in a way that's actually going to be really useful to students when they become practitioners, so that they're able to actually concretely think about these as they're going through the design process. So future work that we're actually actively doing right now is we're looking at syllabi from 2021, and we're hoping that this iteration of syllabi will be a little bit different since folks aren't also trying to transition their courses online. Looking at departmental snapshots over a longer time scale, so over 10 to 15 year period, is seeing, are we seeing kind of macro scale changes? We're hoping to open source our rubric so that others can do these kinds of analyses at their institutions. A big thing that we're really aware of is that syllabi are only focusing on one aspect of courses, and that they're not always updated and sometimes not even accurate. And so we're working on doing a kind of large scale survey of instructors along with some interviews to hear from people directly, how are you bringing these topics in to your courses in a meaningful way. And then we've also noticed that people are using really different language to talk about these kinds of topics. I mentioned ethics, equity, justice. Those come up a lot, but in different academic spaces, people are using different words, and some, sustainability is the entry point to this discussion, different things like that. So we're doing some work on different academic spaces and what kind of terminology they're using and how they're engaging with these topics. So overall kind of conclusion is that the syllabus analysis is providing one piece of the puzzle when we're understanding the presence of design justice in design courses. It's allowing us to identify some positive examples and ways that we can further improve design courses. So I'm really excited to answer your questions, and again, as I mentioned, we're really looking to expand this to more institutions, so we're not just looking at one space. So if anybody's interested in that, feel free to reach out as well.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?